Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here because normally I get invited to slightly less exciting places than Barcelona, but not just for that, but because we discussed a bit before. But we actually have it a long time coming that we meet in person, Yolanda and I, and then also it's fantastic to be here at IDRA and to meet you. And I'm very excited for the conversations that we have after this talk. So I'm going to get started. I sort of structured this in two parts, but the parts are quite undefined. So the first part is sort of setting the scene a bit. I'm going to talk a bit about what I understand as economic democracy and the way I work with that term. I'm going to talk a bit about the local state as well and why I use that term rather than maybe local government. And then also I'm going to talk a bit about public ownership. And then I'm going to give you the who, what, why, where, how, and when of democratizing public services and how I've worked with that and studied that in the past. And then we're going to go into a bit more detail for case studies. And the first case study will look at this idea of the state, and the second one will look at a little bit at a new common sense around economic democracy and sort of alternative economic futures. And I'm going to end on a sort of thought that I'm developing a little bit right now around common sense and public wealth, and maybe it'll be interesting to get some of your ideas on how well that works afterwards. Okay, so wrong way. There we go, setting the scene. So this is the part that is actually quite sad. We sort of find ourselves in late stage capitalism, very much a neoliberal variant of this capitalism. We also often talk about it as crisis. So this sort of intersection of economic crisis and recession, the COVID pandemic, the climate emergency, war, genocide, conflict, cost of living crisis, sort of a whole thing together, right? People use different terms for this. So we work through the conjuncture, we work through sort of moments or particular crisis points. Generally, I would say it doesn't matter what we term it. There seems to be an understanding that we're in a particular time right now in which we're sort of struggling to see the merits of the current system that we live under, particularly an economic system. This has sort of led to sort of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism specifically, not working for most people at this point, and it manifests in their everyday lives. It no longer manifests in the fact of, are we able to buy large property or big boats or sort of luxury goods, but actually, can we afford food? Can we afford energy? Can we afford sort of the basic necessities, social care, healthcare, and so on? And these everyday lives, this everyday scale, I think, is quite important in sort of emphasizing the crisis, but also for us to look for transformation and possibility beyond this. End of history, basically, as we were promised in the 90s, communism lost, capitalism won. We're now in this sort of system of seamless flourishing and progress. That's come to an end, but what's next is the question. And obviously, we often have this sort of image in mind, but I would say, no, it's not fine, and we're looking elsewhere for this. And how can we move on from the this is fine to a sort of this is the alternative, or the alternative needs to happen now. And one of the key framings I use for the economic democracy. Sorry, I'm sort of looking at my slides here also because I wonder if you can even read this in the back, but not all of them are this wordy, so apologies for that. But economic democracy for me is a term that is quite intuitive. So we're trying to democratize the economic system. It obviously is also, like many things are, an academic concept. And academically, it is a bit contested. I hear myself. Okay. But one of the ways that I define it is alongside Eric Olin Wright, the late theorist, who called for this sort of idea of real utopia. So finding alternatives within the current somewhat shitty system we inhabit, but finding sort of progressive, radical, even possibilities in that. And what he sort of what he says about economic democracy is that it's a normative approach. He uses it almost synonymously with socialism. He uses it with a system that moves very much against capitalism, so an anti-capitalist idea of transformation. He works with different logics in this. He says there are already approaches in the system of capitalism which is not dominant. So we have a capitalist system, No, sorry, it is dominant, but it isn't all encompassing. So we have this capitalist system, and people work in many ways against it. So people might be trying to tame it. They might be trying to make some of its harms a bit more palatable. People might be trying to escape it. I've certainly dreamt of buying some sort of Scottish castle with some friends, just raising a loads of chickens and ghosts and having bees, self-subsistent. But these are still just ways of taming and escaping the current capitalisms that we experience the sort of current harms of. There's also ways of obviously moving beyond capitalism. Wright calls this smashing capitalism. So, for example, moving towards revolutionary systems that then transform into communism, anarchism, socialism, and so on. But he also sort of advocates for a particular type of eroding capitalism as a strategic logic that says we don't have to go the revolutionary path, might not have to go the revolutionary path yet. Um, hmm, okay, yes, that sounds better. So we can basically build more democratic, egalitarian, participatory, and non-capitalist economic relations within this current system. Um, Displacing the dominance of capitalism, but maybe not yet taking it on as a sort of system itself, because it does seem impossible at times when we look at the way the state is formulated against these anti-capitalist aims, and also when we look at the way the economy is very much formulated against these more radical aims. So what he says is then changing the rules of the game in order to neutralize some of these harms, and also to create alternatives anchored in the state, as well as new emancipatory economic relations from below. And I like Wright's formulation because while I'm not a complete statist, I do think the state will, in the short term, play a key role in the way that we transform our economies. And it will also, in the long term, sort of play some sort of role because we have not yet found a good conceptualization beyond the state. This doesn't mean it is absolutely necessary for an anti-capitalism, but it is for now. And as such, we need to rethink how we can work with and through the state towards these capitalist futures. Okay, so that's the sort of economic democracy idea. I'm also working with the ideas of Andrew Cambers and Bob McMaster and others, Susana Carbasso and Michael White, in their paper from 2022. Bob and Andy, the first two, are colleagues of mine at Glasgow. And they sort of put forward this expanded framework of not just thinking about economic democracy as a collective endeavor, which we have for a long time. We think about it as something that is located at the workplace, that is located in the industrial sphere. So we might call this workplace or industrial democracy as well. That is very much centered around the work of trade unions, around collectivism, around cooperatives even. But they say that this is fine. We need to think about that. We need to all of the Marxist, socialist, autonomist, reformist, and reform-based, and all other conceptualizations of collectivism and cooperatism. But we also need to recenter the individual. And I like that idea because it's almost like we forgot the need to think about individual rights and freedoms, and we have ceded that very much to the right. So the right often uses this language of, well, we are here for individual freedoms. We're here to defend, the interest of the individual to live out their alternatives, their futures. But we don't really use that language on the left. And to rethink how we can bring economic democracy on an individual level is, I think, an imperative in order to make it happen as an alternative. So this means not just to think about unions demanding workplace changes, progressive changes in the workplace, but individuals having this sort of level of participation in their own work, in their own labor, in their own production again. So how do we structure our work? What does work even look like in an alternative economy that isn't centered around profit maximization and shareholder gain? So worker self-governance and participation in decision making that is all the way down to the individual and not just like stopping at the union or the collective. And then crucially, they say this needs to happen within a democratic public sphere. And this is a lot that I think about as well. They use a quite useful framework for this. So they talk about 4 different of that, critical spheres. The first one being the workplace, the microeconomy. Obviously, we want these places to be structured as progressively, as radically as we can, to have participation and co-determination there, again, individual and collective. Culture and governance is the next sphere. This sphere sort of concerns how do we organize our civil society to strengthen it? How do we benefit from the various actors and the variety and diversity of these actors in our civil society? And how can we build those strengths and experiences into better governance models? So there's how do we govern this new economic democracy plurally? The third sphere is macroeconomic. So this is macroeconomic policy almost. Stuff that really right now the elites deal with. So these are political elites, but only the heads of the parties and the ministers of finance and so on, and obviously the economic elites who are lobbying them. But these are not necessarily dispersed to individuals or even collective organizations to have participation in and co-determine some of these policies. And this also means that we increase democratic control in key for society, energy, and so on. I'll come to these, but also things like banking that are extremely far removed from economic participation at this point. And finally, political constitutional structures. And with that, they mean legal rights, sort of what are the rights of individuals and societies? How can we expand rights of determination, co-determination, economic decision-making? But also, how do we regulate various existing institutions, and how do we sort of exist towards our political economic institutions that actually make difference for our lived experience? Okay. So the key two things about economic democracy then that come through are questions of ownership for me and governance, and those go hand in hand. There's not one without the other, basically. The moment we transform things in terms of ownership, when we move from private to more public or collective forms, that's great, but that doesn't promise us that these are actually going to be more democratic. So there's a difference between democratic public ownership, and I think the democratic bit comes in the governance. And governance is such a slippy term, but for now we're going to need to go with sort of the level of access, participation, transparency, decision-making power that we have over processes. And this, I think, plays in with a sort of shifting common sense as well, a demand that we can make towards restructuring our institutions. Cool. And then for the final bit of theory, the local state, beyond local government, I already sort of hinted at that. Obviously, local governments are important, but I think the local state captures the sort of more wider variety of actors a bit better in any sort of local process. Because often it isn't just, even if local governments implement changes, it isn't just the local government that pushes for them. Ideas for radical and progressive changes usually come from civil society actors, or they might come from community groups that have a good idea or have built up a new model. They often come in terms of collaboration already. So Yolanda and Bertie have just published a fantastic book that looks at the radical municipal hypothesis and also on the potential of public common partnerships. So moving beyond just state level provision. So the local state for me captures this process a bit better, the diversity of actors, the complexity of these dynamics, and also the station of these dynamics in the local sphere. And then, as I said, we're going to go through a whistle-stop tour of the who, actually the first the what, then the who, the where, when, why, and how of my research into democratic public services and their reclaiming. So this all started when I started working on a project that basically was interested in this increasing interest in a phenomenon of what we call remunicipalization, so taking things back into public ownership at the local or municipal level. And this came as part of a wave of an interest into de-privatization. More and more people were trying to look for alternatives locally. But basically what we call this is a pro-public movement that is made up of different actors. A lot of them we'll get to. But a diversity of actors and not just academics, and very much coming out of sort of lived experience. And what unites them, even though they don't have a shared website or a shared organization necessarily, is these demands for more accessible, affordable, quality public services that work for the workers that work like through them or deliver them, but equally also for the communities that receive them or access them. So rethinking public services and infrastructures. That's the what. In terms of terminology, public ownership for me means not just state level ownership. It means um, it could mean provided by a local government, but it could also mean collectively or in sort of common ownership. I just say public because it's longer to say public, collective, and common ownership every time. And I do think that the term public signals to something other than the state, much like the sort of local state, local government debate. I like to think through terms in that way if they sort of signal to something more. And I think a public signals to more than just a government, again. Um, that said, local governments are key actors in the provision of these services, and a lot of them drive the service delivery, particularly through in-house service, but also through public companies and public associations. Sometimes they are in cooperation with cooperatives. Sometimes they are in cooperation with community organizations, so the public common partnerships, for example. But they always stand sort of in contrast to these older forms of state ownership that we're used to. And this is not just a choice for political advocacy, because a lot of people don't react that well to state ownership. They have these immediate memories of the Soviet states and how that impacted the people, the violence that was caused uh, through these models of ownership as well. And other people just think of it as a sort of archaic and not aged well model. So public ownership seems to get the idea across more. What we also use is the term deprivatization. And this is an umbrella term for me for all sorts of processes that act to take out the private component, the private profit component, shareholder logics, neoliberal aspects of ownership. And this might be because they remunicipalize, so take things back after they had been previously privatized. It might also be because new things are built up, which we call municipalizations. So new enterprises being created, either to fulfill a new service or sometimes just to have like a different sort of ownership structure. So it becomes a bit more fiddly. But yeah, so we have remunicipalization, municipalization, and we also have renationalization, so taking things back at the national scale. But some of the research we've done, the renationalizations don't play a huge role. So we do see this very much as a local, regional process rather than a national one. And then I've mentioned this before, remunicipalization is this return of assets, infrastructures, and services to public ownership at the local level. The majority is at the municipal level as well. There is some intermunicipal cooperation and some regional cooperation. This is usually just because telecommunication is actually not something that a small town can do very well by itself. It's better if it's run in an intermunicipal. So there's often pragmatic reasons for different scalar expressions of this. Who, I did say, research does not exist in an academic vacuum. It very much came out of advocacy as a topic of research, and very much also as one that exists to express a pushback against neoliberal privatization, but also marketization. And that came from various global unions, global trade unions, and labor organizations and their research institutes. And their researchers, and then also at the same time and in collaboration with sort of progressive advocacy organizations, including the Transnational Institute, the Democracy Collaborative, Corporate Europe Observatory. So the people who work in that space of social justice mostly. And then who does the actual remunicipalizations and deprivatizations? Obviously, they are enacted, not obviously maybe, but they are often enacted by local governments. But the campaigns for them or the processes towards them, sort of the wider story about them, that isn't something that is just a government story. So this usually involves at least some aspect of advocacy groups, campaign groups, civil society actors, trade unions, labor organizations, politicians, And I'm quite interested in how these are differently articulated. Where this is ongoing research, and this is a screenshot from a website that we run with Transnational Institute. It's called Public Futures, the Public Futures database. This collects and maps cases of deprivatization across the world. Now, you can see there's a hotspot sort of in Europe. There's also some strong cases in North America, South America, some in Australia. Should say not representative in a quantitative sense. We scientists with a very qualitative research orientation, so doing databases is a weird experience for us, and we've done it wrong. If you ask database scientists, because we add way too much context. There's loads of case material, sometimes links to newspapers and so on. But what it still does is it's the only comprehensive collection of these cases, and it's crowd. So people submit the cases to us, and they submit evidence of deprivatizations in different sectors and so on. The problem with that is that it reaches only certain places. It doesn't reach everywhere. So we definitely have bias in who we reach, partly from our language, partly from our networks and so on. So we definitely know this can't be the whole story of Africa. It also can't be the whole story of Asia, but we have limited skills in reaching these, I guess, communities. So ideally, we'll have more money soon to employ more researchers, and then we might fill in some of these gaps. But yeah, for now, this is the story, where it's a global story, but unevenly distributed. Also where all the sectors really. I'm not going to read them all out. Increasingly, this pie is getting more and more diverse. So the original sectors were sort of energy and water, but we also see now remunicipalizations, deprivatizations in basically all sectors of provision. I think, yeah, this slide is actually on the Public Futures database, gives a bit of the backstory. Now, in April, I checked the numbers before I came out, 1,800 cases, 77 countries, and 92 diverse essential services. But again, this is crowdsourced, so this is definitely the tip of the iceberg. And why? 3 framings. The first one, crisis. I started with this framing. I guess the why here goes to, well, why now? But it did start our sort of the interest in public ownership and our data collection started in the mid 2000s, very much ticking up after the global financial crisis. This is partly because a lot of services and infrastructures and assets had to be renationalized. There was a huge renationalization of banks, which has all been undone, unfortunately, since then. But there was also a lot of selling off of infrastructures because the private providers couldn't provide them anymore. They had folded. So definitely the crisis played an important point or reason in this, but also the climate crisis and increasing interest in building environmental regulations and sort of protections up plays a role too, because the private is just not interested in profiting anything really. So it comes back to the public to do these sort of things and to provide alternatives. So a lot of infrastructures are being taken back in order to be improved, to be innovated on, and to be made sustainable. Another framing is unfulfilled promises. This sort of coincides with the global financial crisis. In this case, it's about privatization. So a lot of places had, since the 70s, since the 80s, experimented with privatization. So by the mid-2000s, there was a good 20 to 30 years of evidence of how privatization was just not fulfilling its promises. It wasn't more efficient, it wasn't more or better quality, and it wasn't cheaper. In fact, it had sort of gone against all of these trends. It also had deteriorated workers' rights and conditions. So this is the reason why a lot of the trade unions are involved in this. Health and safety at work had deteriorated, pay had deteriorated. And we saw a sort of lack of transparency and also innovation. So again, this is in relation to the environmental regulations a lot of the time, but we didn't see that innovation that is promised in the private sector. But we should recognize that alongside privatization, we still see privatization as well. Because it's not always a straightforward choice. And often there's also institutional legacies that very much path dependency-wise restrict local governments to these choices. Right. And the final framing is neoliberalism. And I think I sort of talked about this as well. This is again a point that comes out of a combination of the crises and the unfulfilled promises of some of this. But more broadly speaking, people were asking, is this a moment of crisis for neoliberalism, and can we move past this? Is this such a serious crisis now that we might actually change track and another capitalism will emerge, or hopefully maybe another post-capitalism will emerge in this post-neoliberal future? Okay, so very quickly, I think, yes, I have some time. Case studies. So we're going to talk about the German case, which is the story about the local state. And we're also going to talk about the US case, which is a story about common sense, as I like to call it. Now, for the person who gets the translation, I apologize because there'll be German words in the German material now as well, but I'm going to explain them in English, so hopefully that can be translated. Right, so Germany was an early epicenter of this deprivatization trend, the remunicipalization trend, we call it Rekommunalisierung. There are 400 cases in the public figures database, though obviously this is limited because it's crowdsourced, but it's a significant of the 1,000 overall cases. There's an emphasis on the energy sector, which is actually waning now, but there was a clear sort of connection to the energy transition project, the public policy commitment to the Energiewende, energy transition, that Germans have and had for the whole duration of Merkel's presidency or chancellorship, but also before then, dating back to the 80s, Germans just like energy transition, not more than others, I would say, but there was a commitment like, yes, we're going to do this. And I think this sort of long-term commitment, also over and across different political orientations of the government, did help in this remunicipalization experience. But when we first looked at these cases, they were even more extreme. We had found fewer cases elsewhere, and we were asking, like, why in Germany? What's happening in Germany? And there's three reasons that we could dig into. Firstly, this is neoliberalism again. There's a different type of neoliberalism in Germany. I'm not going to bore you with the economic histories and philosophies of this, but there's an ordoliberal the sort of train of thought that influenced German political economy quite a lot in the 20th century, more than the neoliberal Anglo-American experience. And this ordoliberalism morphed into a neoliberalism in Germany eventually as well, but it was one that was maybe more restrained. It's basically one of the key things for remunicipalization is that there was a particular emphasis on having concession contracts in place when they did privatize services, which meant that it was easier to deprivatize them. There were more backstops in place for the decisions that were made. Some of these contracts were shorter. This is a sort of weird niche economic aspect. There's also a wider legal administrative aspect, and this is dating back to World War II and the sort of post-Hitler efforts to make Germany into a democracy again. And we actually have to thank the Americans for some of the more progressive elements, very sort of contextually specific but progressive elements of decentralization of decision making that were inbuilt in this new German constitution at the time. So the German constitution is actually one of the youngest in Europe because of this horrible fascist experience, but has sort of constitutional capacities that other countries don't necessarily have because of the time that it was, the very specific time that it was written. And I've thought a bit about this, so I'm going to tell you about that as well. And then again, the policy, I did say this already, but the other contributing factor is this energy transition idea. So contextualizing German cases then, understanding the local state context for me is about thinking about what is possible in terms of municipal government in Germany, which we have this term kommunale Selbstverwaltung, which means municipal self-government. And it is part of this post-1945 process to build up a German democratic state. This was placed at the municipal level specifically because pragmatically it was the most intact level of government. The fewest Nazis basically were in the municipal level. Obviously, some Nazis, but not quite as many as in other levels of government. The federal state government obviously had been completely taken over by fascists. So the municipal level had sort of more political actors and also more intact structures that could be relied upon and built up immediately in the post-war era. Politically also, municipalities are the closest to the people. So the idea was to build up German democracy from below. And what they did is give as much power to the municipalities because that's where people could have individually and collectively as much impact as they sort of could have had, basically, rather than, electing federal government officials. So that's the idea of municipal self-government. Öffentliche Daseinsvorsorge is hard to translate. It's sort of public provision, public well-being provision, we call it. It's a German social welfare obligation, which is also written in this constitution. And I'm going to go briefly through those two, because I think they frame deprivatization in Germany importantly. So municipal self-government is written into the Grundgesetz, the basic law, which is the de facto German constitution, and it legally enshrines the self-administrative abilities of what we call administrative bodies. So this might be municipalities, might be cities, might be rural authorities, but the smallest level of basically. And it gives very significant autonomy and independence to municipalities to govern their own affairs. And this means to govern their own economies. So we have a term for this, municipal economy. The municipal economy and the powers that these municipalities have allows them to raise taxes, pay for things, lead their own investments, but also for the large part provide services and infrastructures and have a lot of say over sort of spending and production. And there is a sort of solidarity mechanism that makes sure that not one city is much more wealthy than others, but that's too complex for now. So this is sort of saying there is much more potential here than in other places to govern their local affairs in the German state. And what this is combined with is the social welfare obligation. Again, there's a bit of philosophy here for those of you that are interested, but this is sort of going beyond public provision, because öffentlich would mean public, Vorsorge means provision, Dasein is a whole thing that Hegel and Heidegger built careers out of. It's hard to explain. I kind of call it well-being provision because it goes beyond just provision. It's not just water and energy. It would mean sort of a quality of being alive, and it does do that. So it means as well, and it means recreation and theater and arts and music and so on. So the idea of provision is much more expansive. But yes, so I think in the interest of time, I will move on. It encompasses sort of this assurance of general and non-discriminatory access to essential goods and services as necessitated needs of the citizens. And that means while it includes all of the things we regularly see in public service provision, it is an open and dynamic term. And we've had discussions in Germany, for example, including broadband, because that is now a necessity for people's lives. So this is a sort of dynamic social welfare obligation. We have the municipal government where we can have quite a lot of power to do things locally. And in that, we see this deprivatization, and we probably see more of it in Germany than elsewhere. So there's an importance of the local state. And then this local state context, the political legal context, the culture and governance context, that combines with other policies, for example, for the Energiewende. And we see some fairly radical, but sort of not really radical examples. So one of the key examples that I'm going to talk to a bit is energy provision in Thuringia. Thuringia is one of the eastern German states, former eastern, and they have altogether, all the municipalities, 800 of them, bought back their energy provision from E.ON, which is a huge multinational energy company. And that was at the time the most expensive deprivatization in Germany at 950 million euros. And it also is now one of the largest municipally owned providers. It's a regional provider. So this was really quite a big deal back in 2013, but it didn't make that much news, basically. It was also all done by, yes, by the sort of authorities of those municipalities who saw an opportunity for sort of getting some ownership and governance back here. The financing was the most, I guess, contentious part of this. Basically, everyone in Thuringia was sort of like, yeah, this is a good idea. We should do that, except for the Lib Dems, who were like, nah, it's too costly. But basically what happened is that they had to form extremely complex legal structures in order to all access a municipal loan together, which they did. And there was some concern about what would happen if a municipality defaults. It's all hypothetical because municipalities, they don't normally default in Germany, but I guess they could. And then what would happen to the poorer performing ones, because the loan conditions were tied to the structure that they formed rather than the individual municipalities. Anyway, it was complex, but they navigated all of this because of the powers of the sort of German local state, and they got to sort of halfway through loan redemption, I think, when I talked to them about this, and they were doing really well. They above average. Everybody saw it as a success story, and now they have control sort of over their energy system in Thuringia. They have really wasted no time to transform it in quite progressive ways. So they're redirecting investment into their local labor force. They've started up apprenticeships and training programs. The workers have better conditions. So they did all of the sort of collective and co-determination work. And they're also really driving energy transition politics, Energiewende ideas in the local state. They have installed wind turbines, hydropower, e-mobility. They phase out the last of the coal infrastructure, replace that in innovative ways with sort of hot water storage tanks, which use heat from a modern gas engine plant, and use that for district heating. So there's really innovative and sort of locally embedded energy politics going on there. They did smart meter calibration, fiberglass expansion, and so on. So they do a lot. And this is all under public. It would have not been possible under the private owner. And basically, it's what they talk about, though, is that they create value. So they're like, we have all of this value, we have all of this wealth locally, and we're creating it. And this obviously is an interesting development that the German men in suits that are all called Jürgen and Stefan talk to me about what is essentially community wealth building, but they would never call it that. They call it Wertschöpfung, which is interesting. So yes, this, by summary, is a the German case is an element of this strong local state that makes it possible. And it also produces local wealth and value in quite radical ways, but we wouldn't necessarily see this as a radical example. There was no citizen mobilization. There was no big, sort of Barcelona, Paris, Berlin experience of people going on the streets and demanding this. This is all sort of happening in the background. And it makes me think, are the democratic measures in place? Can people actually be closer to their energy systems now? The economic gains and decisions that are being made about this? Probably not. But because their mayors sit on a board, they might have slightly more access to it, but there's no direct participation from citizens. But what they're doing is changing the rules of the game. In terms of critical spheres, we see this key sort of interaction of a lot of these political constitutional spheres, the macroeconomic, particularly energy, and then sort of rethinking a bit and workplace potential, but we see limits in the governance models here. Okay. The second case is the US. I will go through this very quickly. Okay. So this is more about common sense. We're interested, or when I say we, this is because I don't do this research by myself. There's a sort of group of researchers. I don't use the royal we. So we were interested in this case as capitalism and hyperdrive in the US, right? This is sort of what we think of capitalism. We think of the United States. We also don't really see a lot of public ownership potential there. But until recently, when we found a lot of or cases in telecommunications, they were all very similar. They were all very rural. So there was a sort of market failure because the broadband providers didn't really want to provide internet services in extremely rural and remote areas, so they just didn't. And then people needed to organize this themselves. So there was a lot of sort of public common forms of telecommunication provision in the US. So we were interested in that. But then the pandemic happened, so we actually looked into what else was happening. And we shifted gears a bit to newer development, and that is around public banking, because that's a key asset that we don't normally look at in these debates about services and infrastructures. Now, public banking in the US is quite new. So it's quite small still, but it's happening in various cities. I should say none of these proposals have been realized. These are all just campaigns. So they're sort of cases in action rather than actually existing cases. But we looked at Los Angeles, East Bay, and San Francisco. And what they do is they advocate for wholesale banks. These wholesale banks are not retail banks, so people can't have accounts at them. People have no way to bank through that. Wholesale banks just exist for governments to move their money flows and their through these banks and hold deposits in these banks, and then potentially use them according to their mandates, responsible needs. So this is the idea of these public banks, public wholesale banks in California. We should say that there is no public banking history in the US. So there's obviously quite a lot in terms of credit unions, savings and loan organizations, but there's no really public banks. Unlike in Europe, obviously we all have them. We have development banks and so on, but they don't really have that. They only have one, and this is a very niche case. I'm going to have to skip over that, but you can ask me questions if you want. The Bank of North Dakota, which was established in 1919, and it has a radical history, because even in North Dakota, in 1919, somehow they were they were facing some of the same things that we face today, and that people in California face very much today. And this is why they're demanding something similar. They faced extreme weather events, and at the same time, quite strong impact on their sort of rural economies, and banks that were removed so far from their experience that they didn't understand or could provide the right loan products for them. North Dakotans also at the time faced significantly higher commercial interest rates and so on. So they weren't able to access the financial services that they needed in the sort of climate that they were facing in this extremely rural economy. And then they formed a nonpartisan league which campaigned for economic cooperation in the state. And they campaigned for a range of things, including hail insurance, an elevator, but they also campaigned for a state-owned bank. And they were so successful with this that they won the majority of Senate and immediately put this bank in 1919. And this bank still exists today. It's existed throughout a century, and it's, throughout various crises, it's been sort of like a steady ship approach, which means that it was sort of always reacting to crisis, providing sort of, support measures during the Great Depression. It sells back foreclosed farmland in the 40s. It supports mortgages and so on. It has also then developed this sort of vision for economic development in the state and financial literacy. And then we sort of have, this is supposed to be a GIF, but because it's a PDF, it's a GIF of this ball of dust rolling through. Anyway, then we see this interest sort of come up in the 10s again. So nothing really until that point, until the crisis. And then we see this interest in a state-owned Bank of North Dakota. How can we bring this to various cities? How can we bring this to states in the US? And we did ask sort of what happened in between. And these are 4 vignettes that I've written a bit about for a blog. It's actually quite accessible. But 4 vignettes of struggle that I think lead us to this place. Very quickly, it's the 2011 Occupy Wall Street protests, obviously. So the sort of protests that really put into focus the harmful effects that these big banks that these big finance institutions have on our society. One of the pictures there says foreclose on banks, not people, because it's really that sort of tension between why are we supporting these banks? We've just spent a lot of public money on nationalizing them and then we're selling them off again when we don't do the same for people. I think this is the first sort of public conscience around banking as being extremely elitist and unfair, and we have to do something about it, not just like it's fine. And then this sort of combines with other movements, the divestment movement, big energy struggles like the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL Pipeline, energy struggles that really combine quite a lot of different people, quite a lot of different interest groups, farmers, community groups, indigenous groups, Black Lives Matter protesters a bit later on. These are struggles that really bring together various strands of like community activism, but with a focus on, again, the banks that fund and bankroll some of these operations, both in terms of how they have investments in those infrastructures and continued fossil fuel extraction, but also in the way that they repress some of these conflicts. And this is how then Divest LA, for example, and various city level movements come out of this. And Divest LA is actually the origin story for Public Bank LA, so the municipal public banking initiative that they have in LA at this point. Because they realized even if we divest successfully from these banks, there is no alternative infrastructure for us to bank that is better. We just have to move to another one of these banks, and then we have to do it all over again. So rather than be reactive, we're just building up this new institution now. And these are people, they have no background in public banking. They have background in housing struggles, Black Lives Matter, indigenous movements, social justice, environmental justice, climate justice, and so on. They don't really get it, but they learn. And they build up this movement in record time. So from 2017, they sort of establish a volunteer initiative. And then in 2023, City Council actually approves the funding of a feasibility study for this bank. Because in the middle, they were lucky. And the state of California passed, not lucky, they lobbied for it intensively. I shouldn't diminish that, but yeah, they passed a state law that actually makes these banks possible. So this is also within a pandemic. I don't really know how they're not burnt out, but yeah, so this is a massive effort towards rethinking public institutions, alternative institutions in something that we haven't really thought about before. And one of the organizers here, she says, this is a very common sense and practical demand and idea that people recognize. So she uses this common sense language suddenly as something not neoliberal, there is no alternative, but as something that is actually very progressive and the only logical option for them to just create this bank because there didn't exist one. So this is how I've come to the common sense story, that there's a new, different type of common sense that people now appeal to. And this is sort of made possible by these sustained campaigns, but they very much reject other common sense or previous common sense narratives that there is such a thing as only experts can, deal with our finance. And this is another quote from another activist that we speak to, and he says, yeah, public opinion actually easy, peasy, no problem, people get it. But the people who don't get it are the state actors, the people who are supposed to implement these new ideas. Very entrenched. So we obviously then have this sort of weird tension between the common sense of the people and the common sense of their administrators, their state actors, which is nice. But yeah, this is also a gift. So as a summary, this is a movement that unites cross-class actors. It unites a racially diverse set of other mobilizations. It is grassroots. And it builds on these sort of previous movements and achievements, but it goes beyond these because it formulates actually not just another idea, a public bank for LA, but a whole other alternative economic vision that is very much supporting sustainable, green, and just transitions and local alternative economic development. And I think it speaks very clearly to the macroeconomic arenas of like thinking about banking and culture. And it attempts to sort of restructure this political constitutional setting as well. Okay, and then maybe I just end here. This is another quote from Wright that says, there's an opportunity to use state power to expand space for building alternatives to capitalist economic relations from below in ways that over time encroach on the dominance of capitalism. So rethink how can we use the state, imperfect as it is, to rethink this sort of economic democracy. And yes, I think this is maybe, I did say I would talk about this. This is the last slide. So yes, I think there's something there that I would like to get to, and maybe I'd like to have a discussion with and test a bit here, is about public wealth as a term. And then we sometimes talk about commonwealth. In Britain, this has the weird sort of imperial connotations that I try to avoid. But public wealth for me is much more about, can we think about wealth in not its individualized forms, not these sort of super yachts and tech overlords and all of that, but think about wealth that we already have in terms of the sort of forces of production of what make our societies. And we see these across, if we use that language, sort of land, labor, and capital, and instead of enterprise, maybe ethos. All of these examples that I talked about have some combination of that. They make demands towards rethinking wealth and value in land and in infrastructure and in services. They make demands of rethinking it in labor and what we produce as people, but also as workers. They make demands towards capital and how it can be redirected, and they very much speak to this shifting ethos, common sense, or idea. So yeah, I think there is a necessity for new popular beliefs, to quote Gramsci, and maybe that's a good place to end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah? Okay. Funciona? Oh, vale. Thank you very much, Franziska, for this talk. I think your presentation was really, interesting and rich. And I think it was interesting and rich because it has helped us to put into context many cases of deprivatization, of remunicipalization that we are witnessing in our context in Barcelona, or at least attempt of deprivatization and remunicipalization that we have witnessed in our context in Barcelona and in Catalan cities. And I think it's important to understand that they are part of a, let's say, wider trend of deprivatization. They are not just isolated cases. So it's important to understand that there is this trend of deprivatization, of remunicipalization, although I'm pretty sure that we cannot talk about kind of reversal of privatization. But I think that, the big picture that you are drawing and all the cases that you have collected, which I think it's like an impressive work that you have been doing with your research, is kind of showing that there are some alternatives and there are ways of challenging the one-dimensional way of managing public services, which has been across the last 3-4 decades, basically privatizing them and outsourcing them. So I think this is important, not because we can claim that there is a kind of reversal of privatization, but that there are some forms and processes and practices that are actually at least challenging it. And so I think, we have in this sense a more diverse landscape of delivering and managing public services across the globe, and especially in Europe. I also really like this how you frame within this concept of economic democracy, because this is where I will be making my intervention, because I think the democratic dimension of this is particularly important, exactly because most of the time when we are talking about how we manage, how we deliver public services, especially in mainstream economic debate, we are talking mostly about, question of efficiency and technical issue, let's say. But I think that the democratic dimension is crucial, exactly because we are talking about public services, exactly because they are like a function of the state. So the democratic dimension is not like you know it's something really crucial. It's not something that needs to be left at the margin of the debate. And this is something that there are, I don't know, many, political philosophers that have, make the argument that we are transferring the decision-making power when we are outsourcing public services, when we are transferring the decision-making power about these services, we are creating a kind of democratic deficit, because at the end of the day, we are transferring the decision-making power about um, crucial aspect of our lives to this actor that, of course, have they do not have they cannot they cannot act in the public interest. They don't have any interest to act in the public interest, exactly because they are private actors. So I do think that, the democratic dimension of all of this is crucial, but not just for the sake of, because we want more democracy, because then this has, impact on our everyday lives, because then this can have an impact on also the efficiency of public services, on how they are run. So this is why I think, reclaiming public ownership is really. But I also think that the distinction that you have made, about public ownership is not the same as democratic public ownership, because public ownership is important, and reclaiming the state, reclaiming reclaiming this service to go back into public hand is crucial, but this is also can be limited, or this is the whole, let's say, argument that run our book that we've been working with Bertie Russell. Exactly because, as you said, there are two key dimensions, which are ownership and governance, and they do not necessarily go hand in hand. When we have the public, I mean, even an outsourced public service to a private company, the ownership is still, the ownership structure in theory is public, but then who is taking decision is like private actors. So I think there is this element about these two dimensions that we need to look at when we are looking at processes, municipalization of deprivatization, which is the ownership. Of course, I think it's crucial that the ownership need to go back into public hand, but also how we structure the governance of that service is crucial. And this is why I do think that we need form of democratization of that governance, not because of the sake of democratization, but because especially, I don't know, I intend democratization attached to a list of value that can be, achieving more freedom, because freedom is also something that we can reclaim from the left, and not something just in the end of the right wing political discourse, because it's a way for achieving more social environmental justice redistribution, because I do think the democratization of this governance can lead towards and these political goal. Um, yeah, and also because I do think that it's important that to establish a sort of social control of this service, exactly because once we remunicipalize them, then even if there is any government change, or there is any change, any major political disruption, then government are entitled to take the decision to privatize them again. So this is a really broad question, but for instance, how do we build this kind of social control, the service? Of course, it would be ideal to have governance structure that include citizen users within the governance structure in order to have the social control embedded within the governance of those services. But I think it's also important uh, also to build that social control around how services are managed. So, for instance, from those cases that you've been looking at, do you have any answer about if this question of maintaining a kind of social control was important, if there is any, geographical context in which this issue of democratization of social control was more relevant than in other contexts, and why maybe? And also, yeah, I have just, I think, a question comment about, the possibilities, because especially when you were talking about the German case, you show us that I mean, there was a kind of window of, of opportunity from the political level. We had the we had the financial crisis, the COVID, etc., that kind of, put back the idea of reclaiming this service in public control at the of the stage. But I think also you've been talking about the possibility of the German state in this sense, and the German local state in this sense. So uh, sometimes, the materiality of the state, all these legal the rules, the legal dimension, administrative procedure, also administrative culture can play an important role in all this process, of achieving deprivatization, remunicipalization, and also democratization. So if there is any way for local government, especially in or the local state intended in its expanded sense, that is local government and civil society, to build pressure and ask for changes in the materiality of the state, ask for changes in the legal dimension, the administrative dimension of the state at the regional, federal, or national level. And if you maybe the US banking movement is kind of going in that direction. But yeah, I wanted to understand if you can, if there are any other cases that can let us think that there are more possibility for change, and that constraints are not so limiting in building these alternatives.
Shall I respond to that? Yeah. Yes.
Try to.
Is that okay? Yes. Okay. Yeah, good questions. And thanks for your comments. I think I don't have definitive answers. We never do, I guess. For the first question, sorry, I'm trying to organize my notes. how do we build social control? I think that is a key one. How do we build that in? I think one of the questions you raised, how do we embed these alternatives? How do we embed these transformations? That's the key question, because they're constantly under attack. And what happens even if we build new ideas up? There's other ways that sort of the powers that be, without wanting to be too conspiracy theorist, will attack them and will try to dismantle them again. So there's a key question about um, how to embed them, how to make them sustainable. I think other two questions are maybe slightly more achievable. As a reflection, I think on the broader one, how do we make this sustainable? I would go with Eric Olin Wright's work and just be hopeful that the more alternatives you build up, the more you build, you decenter sort of the capitalist liberal mode of thinking and governing, the more this will take hold. Which means a lot of upfront effort, but hopefully a sort of consolidation of alternatives in the longer term. Um, I think in terms of social control, then, yeah, this is a trial and crown. This is a very interesting development in California. So they didn't have to actually make a law, but they decided to make a law for these public banks, the Public Banking Act. And that is sort of valid for 10 years. And the 10 years are almost up. So it might actually be that none of the banks get established. Because what happened is that the law was really progressive. And then they had to sort of go through the legal and lawmaking process, very complex processes, constantly back and forth between committees and the Senate and whatever. Their system is honestly it's complex. So, uh, like thinking and reading through this as someone who is not a lawyer is like Jesus. I don't know how the activists did it. Anyway, it's a constant struggle, and but what happened is that became more and more small c conservative, and more sort of backstops will already be put in this law, and now they have to sort of fulfill certain insurance requirements for deposits. And there is no precedent because the Bank of North Dakota, which is the only other public bank, is too old. Like it didn't have the insurance at that point. So they're coming up with all of these new things within the constraints of the system that is just built for the private and commercial banks. So they have these real sort of issues put in place, but at the same time, while that is not great for the Californian cases in other states are learning from that. So the people in New York are having discussions with the people in California, and they're learning like how do we not make the same mistake for this law. I think it is trial and error until we get to a sort of point where social control can be more easily built in, or yeah, and then also be more embedded as alternatives. And the second question, I guess, relates to this, but the materiality of the state and the complexity of this. I think it takes a whole like new research project to understand these, complexities because we work in silos for these. And for this German stuff as well. I grew up in Germany. I'd never really heard about, kommunale Selbstverwaltung, because the municipal self-government thing, because why would I? You only really hear about this or when you read up on it. And obviously there's text, but you're not a lawyer and the language is so technocratic and you always sort of I'm still worried that I got something wrong. And a constitutional lawyer at some point will say to me, like, that's not that's not right. It's not happened yet. But so these sort of things I think um need to be thought through together. It takes time and experimentation. And Germany was lucky in a way that it had to sort of it got the opportunity to build up a new democratic state in the middle of the 20th century, and where we already had workers' rights. We had a sort of social welfare state. Social democracy was strong. Keynes was the dominant economic logic, and the constitution reflects that. Not everybody has this option, but I think it's more about identifying the sort of weaknesses in the capitalist state structures, wherever the context, and working sort of with them and through them. And also for some people who are into this to do that constitutional work. We need the sort of constitutional democratic lawyers. experts, and they to work together with economic experts and with communities. Yeah, it's like an effort that can't be directed from the top. If we want to have it affected from the bottom up, it needs to be a bottom up project. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you more sort of cases of where we can already do this. I think if I could, then yeah.